Real quick, I just wanted to forewarn listeners that I'm compiling this 2 years after they were originally recorded. So there has been a vast improvement, and I'm sorry for any rough spots these earlier ones have. So I hope you enjoy them as they come. Warning: this podcast frequently mentions violent acts and contains graphic content. Listener discretion advised. Now, get comfy and prepare yourself for another episode of
The Nightmare Society.
I was out hiking with my friend. We live in the mountains of western Maryland, and we were about 6 miles into an 8-mile loop we have done frequently when we decided to take some pictures and eat a snack at the summit. This area of the trail had a park, benches and tables, and a parking lot. We were sitting and talking, and I noticed a man just walking around the parking lot alone. He was walking aimlessly and staring at his feet. What confused me was that he was in jeans and a button-down shirt. Not exactly hiking attire. We decided to set off on the last 2-mile leg of the loop. This part goes downhill to the headquarters of the park and is cut out of the mountain/bank. The end of that leg is the parking lot where our car is. You don't have a lot of visibility from the trail, and you have to walk single file. I was walking in front and talking to my friend. I turned around to look at her, and I see the same man right behind her, following at a rudely close distance. I immediately got a gut-wrenching feeling. I noticed that he didn't have any pack or hiking gear and was not even wearing boots. Something about his eyes really spooked me. So a bit more walking, and he continues to follow very close. I say to my friend that I have to tie my shoe as a reason to step off the trail and let him pass us, in case he is only following closely because he wants to go faster than we are. She immediately catches on to what I'm doing, and we pull over. He looks startled, and she says hello politely. He just stares. This is when I notice that he is carrying a stick. As I'm fiddling with my shoe, she stands between us and he passes us. We wait to give him some distance ahead of us, but he immediately slows down. We wait for a bit longer, and he gets to the furthest part of the trail that has sight lines to us, and he turns around, looking up at us. We decided that something feels too wrong about this guy, and we don't want to have to pass him again. So we turn around and walk back up the trail towards the park with the tables and parking. A few minutes of walking up the trail, I look back and see him walking up the trail too. He's following us. I tell my friend to walk faster. We book it up the trail and get to the parking lot area we were at before. We start to strategize and wait, deciding that we will wait to see if he comes back up the trail to the lot. There are more people around here, so we felt safer waiting it out. About 20 minutes goes by and nothing. We are talking about how that could mean that he kept going on the trail and is long gone, or is waiting on the trail where it is more deserted. We see a couple come up from the trail where we were, presumably taking the loop in the opposite direction that we are. We approach them and ask if they saw anyone on the trail between this lot and the next. They tell us they saw a young man sitting on a rock about halfway down. They describe the man who was following us. We explain our interaction with him to the wife and get into a conversation back and forth about whether or not he was a threat. The husband finally interjects and says, "We need to call a ranger. He wasn't just sitting there. He had a knife and was carving that stick." Needless to say, we called a ranger. The nice couple walked that last leg with us to make sure we got to our car safely and then even gave us their numbers in case we needed anything. The rangers then walked the trail, but there was no sight of him. I wish I knew where he went and what happened to him, but I'm glad to know that my instincts are legitimate. So, creepy knife-carrying man in the woods, let's not meet again. I love camping anytime with my friends, and when I came home from college, we would load up our cooler with beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me, so I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day, the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded, yet within a safe distance to civilization that I could run and get help. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also somewhat of a plus for me. It's the same reason that people read these stories. It's fun to be scared. So I make a little camp and get a fire going. I hadn't brought all that much to eat, but I was enjoying myself, eating and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling I was being watched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I hear a twig crunch over to my right, then see a doe bolt from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to the camp with an armful of wood I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside the ring of light cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whittling at a stick I had been messing with. Around 1, I decided to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I had been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion and smoking cheap cigars. Another reason I like camping, I can act however I want. So I passed out relatively quick. About 2 o'clock, I start hearing footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or other animal, more likely a raccoon because I had probably left some food out. I'm still on guard, though. About 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric is being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't shit in my sleeping bag, but I just sat there paralyzed with my K-bar in my hand. I desperately wanted to thrust the knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding out hope that it was some of my buddies from a frat joking with me. And then as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. I was starting to feel slightly more secure because daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but I sure as shit wasn't going to go to sleep. All of a sudden, at about 4 o'clock, I realized I should put my boots on so that if anything did happen, I would be ready. After having stayed up and keeping alert a little while longer, my friend's car alarm goes blaring. I freak the fuck out and run out of the tent. I got about 2 steps before something grabs me around the mouth. I opened my mouth to scream, but instead the person's pinky finger slips between my teeth. I've heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I just clamped down and, there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous, his finger popped off. He screamed, pulled his hand away with the missing digit falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill I was camping on, and I took off right quick in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to. A little sorority girl in a wife-beater, boxers, and steel-toe boots. I had some blood that had oozed out of my lip, not from the finger, but because I had also managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my lip as well. I told them what happened, and they called the police, got me some real clothing, and the man at the house made me a whiskey and coke. When the cops got there, they checked it out, and when they came back, it was light out. They brought me back so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw just made me more scared. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire earlier, The finger was also gone, suggesting he had come back. The kicker is they never caught the guy. So, somewhere out there is a man sitting down to dinner, maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky. Someone responded to this post, pointing out something rather frightening. They noted that likely the man showed up to rape and murder the young woman, and had the gas can with him in order to drench the tent and set it on fire in order to destroy any evidence. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek through woodland and rural villages following nothing but a map and compass, no GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. Anyway, I was out of shape at the time, so my uncle volunteered to take me out in the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight like what I would have to do during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through the woods and a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back to the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees on either side. We were marching onward in silence at this point when all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked late 70s, early 80s, very pale, liver spots dotting his face and a gray-white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go in the woods? The instant thought seeing a guy his age out there in those clothes and those weather conditions was, this guy has lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice, though, that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry. Didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked at seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking him if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, and became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk and then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After maybe a minute, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him, so continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down at the slope, and it was probably at a 40-degree angle, spanned for perhaps 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold on to or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering, how the heck did he cross that so quickly and so cleanly? I mean, at that distance, it is hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear he still did not appear to be wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step toward the edge and was going to try to make my way down when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath, he said to me, "Something's wrong here." We took a few steps back from the edge at this point, and the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon, that they would have all the tools to help him, etc. The old man suddenly got furious. He began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now or there would be hell to pay. His voice had changed drastically. He was practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out of their sockets, his skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter-mile or so to the car, all the while my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get to our car and await the police so we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 whom had dogs with them and packs of supplies like first aid, emergency blankets, etc. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he led us through in the bushes. The search lasted all weekend, but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. One of my weirdest experiences to date. Tonight's stories are yet another chip away at our fragile sense of security. When you think about it, it's fascinating that somehow we convince ourselves that a mere thin pane of glass can protect us from the horrors that await us outside. I personally love the view and the light that shines in through my window as I work each day, but this is a reminder that through which the light can pass, so can the darkness enter. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of
The Nightmare Society.
This is a true story, and it happened when I was about 5 or 6. When I was younger, my parents were always cops. About this time, however, my mother was a paralegal. That's just under an attorney, but they piss people off just as much. And my father was a police officer. I have a hard time remembering how long this took place. Being a child, it felt a lot longer than it actually was. We believe the man followed us home from the grocery store, but Mom truly believes she had to have pissed him off in some way in her profession. She had no idea who the man was and does not remember ever seeing or talking to him. We lived 45 minutes to an hour away from town on a lake, so finding our house could have never been a coincidence. Now, how my house was set up, we had a driveway getting to our garage the back way, and we had a driveway getting to our house the front way. In order to get back to the front without going through the garage was to go around the entire yard on one side, or to go through the snake-infested weeds on the other, if that makes sense. The front driveway had a door to the garage to get into the main door, or my sliding glass door to my bedroom. From my bedroom was a door to the living room. That's important for later. The quote-unquote back way had a door that came off into a large porch, and the driveway connected to my aunt's driveway a few hundred yards. We walked to her house to play with my cousins every day. So all this began with me sleeping in my room and slight tapping on my sliding glass door. The tapping grew louder until I woke up.
I'm already a light sleeper, and being about 5 or 6, I was already paranoid about monsters and ghosts. I woke up to a man, seemingly large man, standing at my sliding glass door, tapping and looking in. I screamed. My parents came in and he was gone. This started happening every single night. It ended up turning into a daytime ritual as well. He had to have had a police scanner and knew when my dad was at work. No one had actually seen him to make a description, and I remember the police department was at our house every single night. Response time wasn't good, obviously, but down the road was my dad's cop buddy, Fred. And I'm pretty sure my uncle was either a cop or a jailer at the time, and again, their house was connected to ours by a driveway. And let me tell you, my uncle is a big mofo. He could easily pass as a member to a biker gang. He wasn't as big back then, but he was still extremely intimidating. I can't give you the events in chronological order, as they are all jumbled. But I remember my mother waking up to tapping on her window. This was odd because there was an entire shed-type area under her bedroom. It was at least 2 stories off the ground. He managed to climb up our tree and jump onto her AC unit that was in the window and watch her from it. I don't know what happened after that specific incident. Either right before this or right after this, my mom was in the post office grabbing our mail. A random man approached her and said, "Do you know who I am?" She was confused. It had to have been before the major stuff started happening because my mom is incredibly intelligent and she would have easily put 2 and 2 together. She looked at him briefly and said, "No, should I?" She went to turn around and leave, and he said, "You will. You shouldn't have represented my wife." And by the time she turned around to get a good look at the man or ask him what he meant, he was gone. She was shaken. I'm not sure what activity specifically took place after this point, or maybe a few days later. I'm working strictly off my memory and my mom's. It's been 20 years, so some things are easily forgotten. I do know that there had been a time when he was at the front door and Mom snuck us up to my aunt's through the back door. He thought we were still inside, and if he hadn't, he wouldn't have caught up to us before we made it to my aunt's house because of the layout of our house. I was terrified, though, so scared he was going to jump out of the trees and kill us. A couple of nights later, maybe, we drove my dad to work, and once we got there, my dad climbed in the very back and laid down. Fred ended up dispatching with my dad's number and signing in as my dad. Dispatch was in on the plan, and everyone knew he had a police scanner. Nothing eventful happened until late that night. My cousin Danielle spent the night with me. I was no longer allowed to sleep in my room. I had to sleep in the living room. Now, the door to my room was open. The sliding glass door locked up, obviously. There was a small walkway we made between our wraparound couch and our wall, but once you enter that door, you were in the living room. So, anyways, we were watching Annabelle's Wish, and sometime we fell asleep. I woke up to the tapping and frantically woke up Danny. We peeked over the back of the couch, and sure as shit, there he was. It looked like he was tapping on the glass with a rifle, but at this point I was young and didn't get a good look, so it could have been a chunky stick. We panicked and speed crawled to my dad's room. We didn't want him to know that we saw him because we wanted my dad to catch him. Dad jumped out of bed in his boxer briefs, threw on his vest, and grabbed his gun. My mom signaled for my uncle and Fred. They were here in a matter of seconds. I don't know how she did that because up there, none of us had cell reception. So maybe house phone? We could see Fred, Dad, and my uncle frantically looking for him. My mom spotted him standing by the tree, and my uncle was only a few feet from him. He saw my uncle, but my uncle didn't see him. My mom tried signaling my uncle, but by the time he saw my mom, the man ran for the boat dock. After this night, it all just stopped. He disappeared and we never saw him, to our knowledge, again. I don't know if my mom would have recognized him or not if we passed him in the store. It's a very unsettling thought. So to the guy who briefly haunted my childhood, let's never meet again. This story doesn't involve me directly, but I was there when everything went down. This happened about a year ago. I used to spend every day at my best friend's apartment building, which was kind of a weird setup. When you walk into the apartment from the hallway, there's a living room kitchen area, and then you walk down a hallway where all the rooms were lined up next to each other. She lived in a big apartment building where each unit was set up similarly and shared a balcony with the apartment next door. Both units have a glass door that leads onto the balcony. Due to the layout, in order for each bedroom to have a window, there's an empty space the width of the balcony between the two neighboring units that share it. This also means that your bedroom window directly looks into your neighbor's bedroom window from about 15 feet away. Now that that's out of the way, the story. My friend and I were in the living room watching a movie on a Saturday night when one of her roommates scurried into the living room looking terrified and exclaimed, "There's a man staring at me from the window next door." She explained that all the lights in the apartment have been off all weekend, so she had assumed all the girls next door had gone home for the weekend. It was a set of college apartments in a dangerous neighborhood. She had the blinds cracked open and was laying on her bed when she saw movement from the dark room next door. She looked over and there was a pair of eyes staring at her from the dark. At first, she thought she was nuts, but a minute later saw a large, dark arm press up against the glass and eyes emerged again. The lights were already off in the living room and we all crouched down and gathered around the glass back door to watch the windows of the apartment next door to see if anyone was inside. Sure enough, after a minute through the blinds, we saw someone moving around and flicking lights on and off. This made us nervous because he could easily walk out onto the back porch and then the only thing standing between him and us would be a glass door. We were all freaked out, but reasoned that maybe one of the girls had given her boyfriend a key card and he was the one inside. On the other hand, the apartments were super easy to break into. You swipe a card down the lock and you're in. There were about 50 units in the building and there was a huge problem with robberies. The next day I was over again and we heard the girls come home. We went out onto the back porch and knocked on their door. When we told them what happened, their faces went pale as they explained that nobody was home and nobody should have been inside the apartment. After informing the building manager of what happened, they all gathered their belongings and went somewhere else for the night. Unfortunately, the building manager didn't give a shit or do anything about it, but a few months later, everyone moved out. Nobody knew who he was or how he got into the building in the first place, since there's a security guard sitting at a desk by the front door. So, creepy dude who broke into the apartment next door and stared through the window. Let's not meet. Just a few nights ago, I had my own weird encounter. I'm a 23-year-old woman, and for reference, the neighborhood my boyfriend lives in isn't the best. Known for regular police lights and sirens, pedophiles living across the street, a gunshot in the middle of the afternoon, and a plethora of other nuisances. My boyfriend and I were coming home closer to 11:30 p.m. on a Saturday night. We had spent the evening chaperoning his sister's 13th birthday party. I'd had a few alcoholic drinks throughout the evening to keep myself sane through the screaming teens, but by no means was I drunk, just a little buzzed. We pulled up to his house and I was carrying leftover cake, pizza, cookies, and a bag of a few more treats, so my boyfriend ran up to the house a few minutes before me to get the door unlocked. He opened the door and went inside to let the dogs out, and I meandered behind him a few moments later. Once inside, I set everything down and locked the door handle. My boyfriend wasn't in sight, so I thought he was either in the backyard with the dogs or in the bathroom, but didn't think much of it. Our blinds are always pulled up a bit when we're not home because the bigger dog destroys them if they're closed all the way. From where I was standing in the living room, I heard a commotion from the backyard. The dogs were barking at something, but there's always stray cats running around, so it didn't come off as unusual to me. So there I was, just standing in the living room maybe 10 minutes after coming inside. I'm returning a text when I hear a tap tap that sounded too familiarly like a finger tapping on a window. I look around the house at first, thinking I'll see my boyfriend just doing something that made that noise, and
Then I remember the blinds to the window are up about 4 to 5 inches. Instinctively, I bend down to look out the sliver of the window into mostly darkness, except for the burning embers of someone smoking. My boyfriend's roommate often has trouble with his keys, sometimes comes home drunk, and he smokes, so I automatically thought he must need help with the door. And like that, I went to the front door and unlocked it. On the other side of the screen door, I peered out, and once my eyes got adjusted to the contrasting darkness from the ceiling light versus the moonlight, it hit me. The man standing in front of the house was not the roommate. It was this scrawny white male with long hair and stringy facial hair and I think glasses. But in the dark it was hard to tell any further distinguishable features. All I could think was, why the fuck did I open the door? Immediately I spat, "Who the fuck are you?" And he replied in this dry, almost whisper, "Is your mom home?" As this was my boyfriend's house, where only he and his male housemate lived, I instantly got chills up my spine. I realized he must have watched me come inside. Maybe he came up just in time so he never saw my boyfriend in the car or in the house, so he thought I was alone. Then I think about the tapping on the window, the dogs barking aggressively from the yard, and how long I stood in front of the window, which translates into how long he was watching me. I just about yelled, "Nobody's fucking mom lives here," when my big dog came running up behind me inside the house, barking as ferociously again. Finally, my boyfriend, who had been in the bathroom and just let the dogs in, tuned in that something was off. He came up behind me in the screen door, and as soon as the man noticed him, he said, "I must have the wrong house." My boyfriend followed with a quick and loud, "Yeah, you have the wrong house. Get the fuck off my yard, bud." The man took a couple of steps back, but turned his attention back to me. He just kind of lingered, not really walking away and not getting closer, but still looking at me. Finally, my boyfriend followed up with another, "Get the fuck out of here." And after that, he turned and walked down the driveway. My boyfriend grabbed the wooden beating stick he has behind the door and walked out to the driveway to watch and make sure he really was gone. I frantically checked the locks on all the windows and the back door as disgusting and terrifying images of what his intentions were played in my head. I know all of the things I did wrong. My dad was a cop and trained me to be hyper-aware of my surroundings. I'm a true crime fan and I listen to podcasts like My Favorite Murder who talk about all the stupid things you shouldn't do, and I preach to all my friends about carrying weapons, not being afraid to slam the door in people's faces, or not even answer if it's dark. I know that there's an incredibly high chance that he thought I was much younger than I am, since I do still look young. That he was watching and hoping that I was alone. That getting me to open the door and tell him I was by myself was all he needed to rush the door, force his way in, and then do whatever he planned to do. I should have slammed the door. I should not have ever opened it, but I froze. I'm just grateful I wasn't alone, that my dog and my boyfriend were there to scare him off, and that we're moving very soon. This happened in 2011 to 2012. My boyfriend at the time, John, and I were 19 and we had just moved in together, both away from home for the first time. We were ecstatic. We picked our first floor 2-bedroom apartment so we'd have space for a roommate in a large complex near our college, thinking it would be perfect for us. Spoiler alert, it ended up being a total dump. The first couple of months were idyllic. We felt safe enough in the area to go on nightly bike rides to get snacks. And then we started having problems. First, our crappy little car was broken into. The window was smashed and the GPS, affectionately named Dottie, was stolen. We reported it to the police and informed our apartment complex. The landlord's response was a compassionate, "That's not our fault." A couple of weeks later, we were laying in bed when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow dart past the window. Our bed was right underneath it.
I jumped up and looked at the closed blinds, only to be greeted by the crouching silhouette of what looked like a man in baggy clothing and a beanie. He appeared to be trying to listen for any movement, possibly trying to see through any crack in the blinds. I was too terrified to look out the blinds, but John did and told me he couldn't get a good look at him. Our presence didn't seem to deter the figure at all. We called the cops and waited. The guy finally took off after 15 minutes of just crouching at our window. An officer arrived an hour after we called and said he'd do a sweep of the area, but he'd already been gone for about 45 minutes by then. This guy, well, I assume it was the same one, showed up a few times a week for months. No matter the temperature, no matter the weather. We called the cops each time, but to no avail. We actually started to get used to him looking in, and after a long period of no escalation, got complacent and began to wonder if he was just a peeping Tom, or eavesdropping Tom of some sort rather than someone casing the joint as we initially assumed. It was always the same thing. He would show up, and we would see his silhouette crouch outside our window for about 15 minutes until he left. The worst part was that I could never see his face or anything. He was too well covered and it was too dark. Essentially, we were being haunted by this creepy, faceless, crouching shadow. We finally bought thick curtains for the bedroom so he couldn't see in anymore. Not sure why that particularly bright idea took so long to appear in our heads, but I'm pretty sure we'd both be the dumb people in a horror movie. I think half the reason we bought the curtains was because we didn't want to see him anymore. Out of sight, out of mind, and all that. And there seemed to be no other choice but ignorance with how unhelpful and unconcerned the cops had been. And indeed, with curtains permanently drawn, we stopped thinking about him for a little bit. John's younger sister was living with us by that time. She was very much a capable woman, so we weren't too worried about leaving her alone while we went on a short vacation. She had never complained about the creeper, though she was aware of him, and he didn't seem to stop by her window. Neither her room nor the living rooms had the same thick curtains as the bedroom. We had our vacation, and when we came back, the first thing she said to us was, "So, your friend stopped by?" Our eyes grew wide. The creeper? She nodded and went on to explain that she was in the living room playing video games in the dark when he walked up to the living room window with blinds drawn, put a flashlight against the window and began knocking on it. Knocking. She had screamed, ran to the bathroom, locked herself in, and called 911. But it was the same story. The cops took forever to show up, and by the time they did, again the creeper was long gone. This set something off in John. Now the creeper seemed to be escalating, and the jerk was fucking with his little sister. I'm positive if she'd called him when this was going down, we would have headed straight back to the apartment during our vacation. Which is probably why she didn't. She was considerate like that. He told me he was going to take care of it himself. I begged him not to. At the same time, I also kind of understood where he was coming from. My fear was not knowing whether the guy had a gun or not, but I gave up arguing. So we kept the curtains open that night and waited for the creeper to show up. Around 1 a.m., he finally did. John grabbed a bat and walked calmly out of the apartment. I hid in the bedroom closet, phone already dialed to 911, terrified of what I was about to hear go down. What I did hear was John giving off a terrifying, guttural scream somewhere near the back corner of the building, followed by the shadow of the guy outside the thin bedroom window standing up, stumbling, falling back, then standing up again and running off. I heard the footsteps of John go charging past the thin bedroom window as he continued uttering that freaky scream. When John came back inside unscathed, the mixture of relief and hilarity of his terrifying howl led us to both laughing until our stomachs hurt. It was kind of awesome to realize what a wimp the guy who had been scaring us for months turned out to be once confronted. And that was it. We even kept the curtains open to see if he'd come back, but that was the last time we saw the creeper, and I hope to never officially meet him. Incidentally, our apartment was burglarized not too long after, along with the neighbors on the same day, but we couldn't confirm it had anything to do with this guy. Seems obvious, although isn't that an awfully long time to be casing the apartment of 3 poor college students?
But the police were entirely unconcerned, even bored by the whole thing. There were cameras in the hallway, but the complex told us, of course, they weren't working that day. We moved out a couple of months before our lease was up because we couldn't stand that place anymore. Summer, 1997. I was 9 and scared of my own shadow, so this experience only furthered my fear of the world. My mom and I drove up to Revere, Massachusetts to Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire to camp. My dad was going to drive up the next morning to meet us because he had to work. So everything was going normal at the campsite. We set up the tent, built our fire, all was well. It was still daylight when we noticed that the lone, greasy-haired man in the campsite connected to ours was continually running and leaping into a wooden post, then attempted to balance himself on one foot. He kept doing this over and over and over. It was odd, but we just figured he was some lonely kook and had a good laugh at his expense. My mom thought maybe he was trying out for the circus. Cut to nighttime. Absolute darkness if not for the campfire. My mom and I were sitting and roasting s'mores over the flames when we heard footsteps approaching from the other campsite. Out of the pines, the lone man stumbled onto our sight, and he was ghastly and ragged in the firelight. I could tell my mom was tense. She asked the stranger what he needed.
"Hey,"
he mumbled.
"I need your help in my campsite."
We waited and he didn't go on. My mom asked what he needed help with. The filthy man said,
"I locked my keys in my van. I need you to come over and help me."
Then he looked at me and said,
"Don't worry, kid. You can stay here with your fire."
I remember getting goosebumps at that. My mom said, "I don't know how I can help you with your keys."
"You must have a spare hanger lying around somewhere,"
suggested the man. My mom told him she didn't. The ghoulish man wouldn't let up though.
"Yeah, you must have a hanger lying around here somewhere. Maybe you dropped one on the ground near your tent."
My mom adamantly told him she didn't have a hanger, and quickly added, "My husband will be here soon. Maybe he can help you. He's a pretty strong guy."
"Yeah, alright."
The creep slurred, and he started to trudge away into the dark. But he turned his head and said,
"Well, if you do find a hanger, come help me. I'll be here."
And with that, the horrible man left. My mom and I barely slept that night. I felt her moving at every sound outside the tent. Looking back, my poor mother must have stayed up through the long night, worrying a butcher knife was going to slash through the tent wall. And so, morning eventually came. And when we stepped out of the tent, we immediately saw that the lone man and his camper van were gone. Later in the day, I heard my mom exclaim. I ran over to her and watched as she picked something up from the ground beside our tent. She held it between us, staring at it, not speaking. It was a metal hanger. I also found out later in life that 4 dead females were found stuffed into metal barrels in Bear Brook State Park back in the 80s, I think. have a few stories. I've seen some weird shit. Possible graves 50 plus miles away from the nearest access road. Shelter structures that don't line up with human survival techniques. Maybe a Bigfoot, though I think it was. It was in all likelihood just a large, curious bear. And some shredded animals deep in the woods without their organs or muscles being eaten, as if someone or something did it for fun. As I've been saying a lot lately in various Reddit threads, what has spooked me the most and turned me into a believer is what I've heard. The scariest story I have is about a night deep in the Oregon woods. I'll preface this by giving my background, not as a brag or anything, just to show that my outdoor and survival bona fides are there. I'm 37. I've literally spent over 5 total years alone in the woods, camping and hiking. I've gone months without ever even talking to another human being. I've taken every class or training you can imagine in identifying animals, especially threatening ones that can kill me. I've walked most of the Appalachian Trail barefoot. I've spent weeks in varying wilderness areas across the US and Canada. I know what a mountain lion sounds like, whether it's mating, scared, communicating, whatever. I know what foxes, bobcats, owls, and varying birds, moose, elk, deer, varying weasels, bison, bugs, sheep, bear, and everything in between sounds like. When you have a hobby like I do and spend every free second alone in the woods, you have to know sounds. It's absolutely imperative to know if something is close by that wants to eat you. Again, I only say all this because it's inevitable every time I tell one of my stories, at least one person is going to say, "Nah, dude, it's just a fox. They scream like bloody murder." Yeah, I know. I've had 3 or 4 sounds that scared me that don't match any animal living in North America. There was only one that made me leave camp early and go back to civilization. This time, I was actually doing a buddy camp with my oldest friend. He's the same age and has more experience in the woods than I do. We met up in Oregon for a 2-week camp in the vicinity of Mount Hood National Park. We were well off the beaten path. No people or civilization anywhere near us. One night, late, at our camp setup, he and I were sitting by a fire, just bullshitting and reminiscing. It's also too important to note that we were sober. I do occasionally drink, and I do occasionally smoke cannabis, but never on these trips. Your sobriety and level head can be the difference between life and death out there. As we talked, from maybe 300 yards or so away, down in a ravine, we heard a howl, growl, scream that persisted for several minutes. It literally vibrated our heads, that's how powerful it was. It was guttural and booming. The only way I've been able to describe it is imagine a huge horror demon is somehow defeated and sent back to hell. Imagine the demon's scream of agony and anger as it's dragged back to where it came from. It was fucking terrible. 2 grown men and decades of experience in both of us carrying firearms for protection. Firearms that if need be could take down a 1,000-pound bear, in hysteric tears, clinging to each other, frantically deciding what to do. We made it until the first signs of day and booked our asses back to our checkpoint and got the hell out of not just the area, but Oregon completely. I'm just now getting to the point I can talk about it, and that's in an anonymous forum like Reddit. This is the closest known recording I've heard that sounds remotely similar.
It's coming from back there too, behind us. See, that's adult. Do you hear that? crazy. That's no dog.
I've never gone out there to quote-unquote monster hunt. It's always been about my love of nature, animals, and solitude. Over the last few months, I've become enthralled with unknown sounds because of my experiences. I've never gone out with any technology except a mobile GPS and an emergency satellite phone. My next trip is coming in May. I've recently invested in solid recording equipment, an FLIR camera, and a solid digital video recorder. This next trip, I'm going to actively devote time to recording the things I've heard. I've posted this before as a reply to a comment. It's been playing on my mind because last week it came up in my time hop and then I thought I'd post it here. So last summer I booked a glamping trip in the next county over. The website looked beautiful, a campsite of 6 large yurts outside a lovely little village. Coincidentally, I had driven through that village before as it's close to a really nice historic castle I like to visit occasionally. So we pay our money and my husband, 2 kids, and I pitch up. It's one of the last weekends of the summer and it was lovely weather. The campsite was on a small hill and the people who owned it lived atop the hill in their farmhouse. We were checking in on a Sunday for 2 nights, as we were shift workers at the time. We passed other people checking out, and they all looked pretty happy. The owners of the site showed us down to our yurt and mentioned that we were the only ones on the site for our stay this time, it being a Sunday. We were happy with that, to be honest, because with 2 young kids, it meant they could make noise if they wanted, and we wouldn't disturb anybody. When she showed us around, she did say the yurt door didn't lock, but none of them did. Which, okay, fine, because you don't lock a tent, right? The place was in its own mini wooded area, and it was absolutely beautiful. The owner also mentioned the kids would be safe to wander because they had a perimeter fence because of their dogs. The first night was fun. We had a barbecue, the kids played and went down to sleep at about 8. I found it hard to sleep, but I often do somewhere new. There was only patchy phone coverage, so we read until we fell asleep. Next morning, my husband seems a bit out of sorts, but I asked him if he was alright, and he was all, yep, fine. So I left it. We went out for the day and had a great time. The whole day was blazing hot, and then we got back. We were washing up after dinner and the kids were playing and a shadow came over the whole place. I felt eyes on me and it went really cold. Honestly, it felt like something bad was going to happen. I felt dread hit me. We'd already paid to stay, but I pulled my husband to one side and said, "We have to leave right now. I don't know why. I've just got a bad feeling. Please, let's just go home." Normally, he'd try and talk me out of something like this, but he didn't. He started getting the kids together and I packed our stuff. We went to the farmhouse where the couple who owned it were sat outside playing with their dogs. My husband started loading up the car while I apologized to them and explained we needed to leave because our youngest was feeling ill. They said how sorry they were about it, and then just as I turned to leave, the man owner asked if my husband had been outside the house last night, about 3 or 4 in the morning. I said no, he hadn't left my side all night. I would have woken up. He asked me if I was sure. By this point, my husband was by my side and answered that no, he hadn't, and why? "Well," says the guy, "the security lights came on and the dogs started barking, and when we looked outside there was a man wandering around who then turned around and walked back down the direction of the yurts. They assumed it was my husband. We both said it wasn't and said our goodbyes quickly. I tore out of that place in the car, and then about a quarter mile down the road, my husband turned to me and said, "You're right. I was quiet this morning. I didn't say anything because I thought you'd take the piss. I wanted to use the bathroom in the wee hours, but as I was about to get up, I heard footsteps on the decking outside. Not hooves or something on 4 legs. Something on 2 legs. I lay there as quiet as possible and hoped the kids wouldn't wake up or something. Nope. It still freaks me out now." I honestly can't believe I'd forgotten about this. This happened back in the fall of either 2002 or 2003, when I was around 12 or 13 years old, near Clinton Lake in Kansas on a Boy Scout campout. I still go backpacking and camping a lot, but this was the last camping trip I remember attending before moving states. We arrived at our campsite on a Friday and planned on staying through Saturday and leaving Sunday morning. I remember us having to set up our tents in the rain Friday evening, but Saturday was sunny and gorgeous. I remember every precise detail, but right before we went out to hike that morning, an old van, perhaps a late 70s model van, pulled into a campsite within view of ours. These guys were hippies with a capital H, and that was my first exposure to what weed smells like when some of us asked if a skunk was nearby. They were too far away for us to hear any specific conversations, but even the adult leaders found this to be a funny sight. One of the leaders, I think, went over there to ask that they stop using drugs in front of us or to move campsites. When we got back from our day hike, those hippies were still at the same campsite and so baked they couldn't play their instruments with any skill. Here's where it got weird. By the time the sun was setting, the group of stoners had completely ditched their hippie attire and had dressed up in total goth style. Some had makeup that made their faces unnaturally pale. Others had black trench coats on, and they must have had a stereo because all we could hear over there was grunge metal playing. That night, after we cooked and ate dinner, all the scouts, including myself, headed out into an open area of the campgrounds to play Capture the Flag. We collectively established the boundaries, which were still pretty close to the group of the now goths, but it gave us a different angle of view to their site. I doubt they had any idea we were there since we played with no flashlights. By this point, the grunge metal had been replaced by this creepy, ominous opera music. I succumbed to curiosity, but I wasn't about to sneak into their campsite. I just crept a little closer to see what they were doing. They had made a large campfire beyond legal limits, and I couldn't see any of the group. On a tree, I saw something that made me initially freaked out, but I figured they were still feeling the weed and any other drugs they may have taken for this to be real and continued to play. I think we only played one game, then retired to our tents. At some point in the middle of the night, all of our adult leaders woke us up and told us to quickly and quietly pack up our things, take down our tents, and get back to the bus. As we were packing everything up, we couldn't help but notice the bonfire was still going strong, but the music had stopped and we heard people talking. The tone didn't sound like casual conversation either, but I couldn't hear specific words. I don't know how to describe it. Once everyone and everything was in the bus, the driver got us the hell out of there. The adults were abnormally quiet and the scouts had congregated to the back of the bus. I don't remember if one of us told the adults about those guys, but we knew it had to have been regarding that strange group. A fellow scout from the other CTF team had also tried sneaking into their campsite and saw the same thing I did. Ever since, I'm inclined to think that what we saw was real, and the reason for us cutting the trip short. Hanging from the tree, he and I saw a decapitated dog and 2 severed human legs. I never learned anything more about that night. I'm a university student now, but this incident happened when I was in the 8th grade. When I was around 14, I studied a subject focusing on outdoor pursuits. For our final assessment, 2 teachers took my class on a one-night camp where we would do activities like rock climbing, kayaking, trail walking, etc. I live in Australia, around an hour from a state forest that was notorious for the backpack murders. Several bodies have been found and several more remain missing. I'm pretty sure all of the murders were linked to the same serial killer. Anyway, in the morning we leave the school and drive out in a bus. When we reach the road that leads to the entrance of the forest, a police car is parked to the side. He spoke to the teacher for a moment, but I didn't hear anything and no one else seemed to notice or care. Fast forward a few hours and we've trekked, about 20 of us, to the camping area somewhere in the middle of the state forest. Some parts are state, some are privately owned, I think. Whilst kayaking that afternoon, we noticed a helicopter doing flybys, but again, my classmates never suspected anything. A couple of mates and I were the first to leave the water and helped the teacher with some equipment and started building our own rafts. I was standing off to the side when one of the national park guides walked over to one of the instructors and talked in a hushed, slightly stressed out tone. I remember hearing the instructor say stuff like, "You're kidding me," and "I don't believe it." He just looked shocked and taken aback. So at this point I start connecting the dots, but I didn't say anything to my school friends. Around dusk that night I go to the toilet block, which is around 100 meters from the main campsite. As I go in, I remember a guy walking around the other side of the block. I didn't see him clearly in the diminished light, but he kept glancing around with nervous body language. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't part of our party, and to me he just didn't fit. I didn't think much of it at the time. Fast forward to the next morning and we get back to the car park. The teacher tells us that a body was found in a dam not far from where we are. They didn't want to tell us so as not to frighten us. We later found out it was a young guy who was killed with an axe, and the guy who did it was related to the serial killer who hunted in the same area. I don't know if that guy I saw had anything at all to do with the murders, but it freaked me out a lot afterwards. Haven't been camping since. I was living with my then boyfriend in a crappy apartment complex behind a rundown mall. He worked at the McDonald's a couple of blocks down the road, and we only had one car. He was working a late shift. It must have been around midnight. He called me and asked me to bring him his phone charger as he was only about an hour or 2 into his shift. I grabbed the charger and head out on foot. I walked up past the mall towards the main road, and along the way I would pass a row of cars parked along the curb. A few cars ahead of me, I see tail lights come on as the car starts up. I keep walking and pass the vehicle, it being on my left-hand side and my apartment complex on my right. I hear it pull out and slowly start driving forward. It passes me and pulls into an empty parking spot a few cars ahead, keeping its lights on. Okay. I speed up a bit and keep walking. There's maybe 40 feet to the main road. Once again, the car pulls out and drives forward. The passenger window rolls down about 5 inches. I take a quick peek and I can see 5 males in the car. 1 driving, 1 passenger, and 3 in the back. Nope. I said fuck this and veered to my right down a pathway that leads back to the apartment buildings. There was a small parking lot in the front of the complex and I lived in the back part of the complex. I walked through the parking lot, making my way towards the back. They pulled into the parking lot and were still driving slow behind me. There were hallways in between the buildings. One end of the hallway faced the parking lot. The other end led to the side that I lived on, each hallway about 30 feet long. I sped down a hallway so at least I would be on the opposite side of the buildings, and they would have to back out of the parking lot and turn down another road to be next to me again. As I walk towards my apartment, there are about 3 more hallways that I pass. Out of the corner of my eye, I can see them slowly passing each hallway, following me to the next one. I went past my door another 2 hallways, then paused. Hopefully they would keep driving to the next one. I took that chance and ran back to my door. I didn't see them in the 2 hallways I passed back to my door. I slipped in and locked the door, keeping all the lights off. My heart was racing. I stood at my door for just a bit, just gathering my wits. Then I heard a car door close. I looked out of the peephole and there they fucking were, parked on the street about 2 doors down. The 3 guys from the back got out and walked in 3 different directions, looking for me. When they realized I was gone, they got back in the car and drove off. So, this happened about 5 years ago while I was 9 months pregnant. I was Christmas shopping at the mall with my then 7 and 15-year-old daughters one Saturday night in a very safe city with a very low crime rate. There was an Applebee's connected to the mall, and we ended our shopping pretty late, and the mall stores were starting to close. So I took my kids to the connected Applebee's for a late dinner. We finish up eating at about 10 p.m. and leave out of the Applebee's entrance into the practically deserted parking lot with shopping bags in tow. As we got to the car, I was in the middle of maneuvering the shopping bags on my arms to find my keys when a 50-ish-year-old, crusty-looking guy starts walking up from somewhere in the parking lot with shaggy, gray-white hair and a faded flannel shirt and old jeans. I noticed him briskly approaching when he was about 40 feet away, and he said,
"This is a stick-up. Give me all your money."
My blood ran cold, and I stared at him owlishly and shakingly said, What? He then said he was just kidding and came up and stood right next to my daughters, who were standing on the other side of the car waiting for me to unlock the car to let them in. He then starts to make small talk with me and my girls. He's asking things like if they were being good girls for Santa, how old they were, and if we got all our Christmas shopping done, what kind of things did we get, etc. He didn't seem drunk, high, slow, or mentally challenged at all. He was very coherent and seemed of sound mind. Mind you, I was a heavily pregnant woman, alone with my 2 daughters in a mostly deserted parking lot at 10 o'clock at night, who was being approached by a stranger who came and stood right next to my kids on the other side of the car, just shooting the breeze, talking to me and my kids with his hands in his pockets and occasionally looking over his shoulder. I didn't want to aggravate him, so I was politely conversing with him and trying to look calm and nonchalant while trying to disguise my frantic hands digging inside my giant purse for my car keys. This exchange went on for a couple of minutes while he periodically kept looking over his shoulder. I was silently panicking and trying to politely keep the situation from escalating by calmly and nonchalantly talking to him, while also trying in vain to find my damned car keys to get us out of there. They were in there hiding good. I felt that at any moment he was going to pull a knife or gun or rob me, and my kids were right next to him, away from their mother on the other side of the car, and I couldn't find my fucking car keys to get my kids into the safety of the car. He kept trying to engage them in conversation, and I could see that my oldest daughter was a little weirded out, and she kept glancing at me to gauge my assessment or reaction to this situation. Kids often tend not to recognize potential danger when they are with their parents, since they see us as their protectors. And being that he was only talking and acting friendly, and I was doing my best to stay calm, they were oblivious to the alarming situation we all were in. And being 9 months pregnant, and I was no match for this full-grown man, especially if he was hiding a weapon on him. While desperately digging for my keys, I tried to politely give him hints that the conversation was over by saying things like, "It was nice chatting with you, but I gotta get these kids to bed," and "It was nice meeting you," and telling my girls to say that it was nice meeting him too. My polite attempts to get this guy to leave wasn't working because he kept sidestepping my attempts and asking them what their favorite school subjects are and how nice young ladies they were, etc., while I was struggling with the shopping bags and digging in my giant cluttered purse for my car keys. My outgoing 7-year-old was completely oblivious to how not okay this situation was, because he was being friendly and because of the whole "I'm with mommy so I'm safe" child mentality. So she started to talk about what she picked out for daddy for Christmas, and started enthusiastically talking about kid stuff and asking him if he knew what Minecraft was, etc., and keeping this creep from leaving us alone by keeping him engaged in conversation. They didn't realize that I was becoming desperate to get them the hell out of there. Then I suddenly felt this sinking feeling of dread when I realized that I may have lost my keys in the mall, and that we were stuck outside with this strange man who kept looking over his shoulders and was showing no signs of walking away, and I was thinking that he was waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. All he had to do was grab one of my girls and threaten their life, knowing it would make me do whatever he wanted as long as he wouldn't hurt them. I started to feel my adrenaline start to spike, and my heart and stomach started doing flip-flops, and I felt like at any moment shit was going to go down, as the gravity of realizing that there were no other people or witnesses around, and that we were totally alone with him, and at that moment the odds were stacked against us, and that he has his chance. Then he all of a sudden was all like, "Okay, it was nice talking with you, see you later," and walked off in the same direction as to which he came. It wasn't until then I found my car keys and unlocked the door and told my kids to get in fast, and I got into and locked the doors and started the car and drove the hell out of there. My 15-year-old lightheartedly and jokingly said, "Okay, that was weird," and laughed. I was overwhelmed with relief, and then I was confused over what just happened. I thought to myself, why the hell would a guy of seemingly sound mind think it totally acceptable to go out of his way just to approach a woman and her kids in a deserted parking lot late at night just to chit-chat? But being that nothing bad happened, I brushed it off and joked about it too. When we got home, my husband greeted us and asked us how shopping went, and I said it went well, and my 15-year-old told him what happened in the parking lot and how weird it was, and was kind of joking about it. I started joking too, saying how I was mentally having a panic attack while trying to look calm, and started making fun of myself by telling my husband how I was attempting to inconspicuously rummage through my purse to find my car keys. My husband went completely white, and I acknowledged his horrified look of alarm, and I assured him that albeit creepy, the guy was just talking and eventually left on his own. Now, my father-in-law is a retired sheriff deputy, and my husband went through police academy training after graduating high school. He decided to go into business school instead of becoming a cop. And being that the knowledge he gained from that, plus growing up with a cop for a dad, I found out why my husband looked absolutely horrified when I told him the details. What my husband told me completely rattled me to the bone. My husband told me that he was 100% sure that the reason why the guy was hanging around us and chit-chatting was because he was waiting for me to unlock my car. And the reason why he was standing next to our kids was because once I unlocked the car and the kids started to get inside, he was most likely going to force himself in the car with the kids and hold a knife or a gun to them to gain leverage on me to force me to cooperate, knowing that I wouldn't abandon my kids, which would force me to get in the car with them and do whatever he wanted me to do, which most likely would have been to drive to a remote location to do God knows what. And being that he wasn't wearing a mask suggests that his intentions were to also leave no witnesses to identify him. I then remembered that he was positioned by the back seat passenger door where my 7-year-old was standing by waiting to get in. My husband then told me that the most likely reason why the guy ended up leaving was because it took so long for me to find my keys, and the longer it took, the more anxious and spooked it made him. And that whole time, I was desperate to find my car keys, which through some sort of divine intervention stayed hidden in my purse, thus saving us from potentially being abducted.
Sweet dreams.